asking blue pill, red pill, corporate press, I've had my fill. I'm just a simple chap, believing in my own will. Rap fire, math evil, scheming, this is no drill. Haters masking boosted, but still with no chill. Need to come and take it if you wanna mess with my hill. We've been 3D printing, set and ready for that ghost kill.
Hello, Canada, and welcome to another episode of the Maple Pill. As always, I'm your host, Matt McKeever, and we're going to be doing a special episode tonight. It's episode number 60, and we're going to be looking at Canada's 2022 budget. So, in case you guys were, hiding under a rock over the last couple of days, Chrystia Freeland and the Federal Liberal Party have released their 2022 federal budget. So, we're going to be jumping into that and kind of looking through high level, a lot of the different items and kind of areas that the federal government's focused on in this round of budget. Now, I haven't had a chance to really dive deep into all the details around this, so this is just going to be kind of a high-level synopsis. Maybe we'll end up doing a second episode next week where I'll dive a little bit deeper into a couple of niche segments or sections of the budget. Let me know, how deep do you want me to dive when it comes to Canada's federal budget? Let me know in that comment section down below. But let's jump right into it. So the first article here I've got for you is from Blacklock's Reporter, and I thought this was a decent little synopsis to remind us where we're at as well as where we're headed based upon this new federal budget that's being proposed. A line we will not cross. Cabinet yesterday said its iron rule of deficit reduction is a yearly decrease in the debt to GDP ratio, currently 45%. It was 30% in 2019. So again, you don't need to be a hardcore economist to understand that that's a significant change, right? When we're looking at in 2019, a 30% GDP to debt ratio, or debt to GDP, I should say, versus the 45% we currently find ourselves with. This is our fiscal anchor, a line we will not cross, said Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. That will ensure our finances remain sustainable for so long as it remains unbreached. Now, I didn't bring up the actual clip of her reading this in Parliament, but there was literally audible laughter, I assume primarily from the Conservative Party, when she said this, because it seems like it's a line we've crossed multiple times in order to find ourselves in our current position of 45% debt to GDP. Budget tables show the federal debt is projected to rise, not fall, while debt interest payments will nearly double. Parliament's debt in the period from 2020 to 2025 is projected to rise from $1 trillion to $1.3 trillion. Debt service charges will grow from $20.4 billion to $37 billion. And if you guys were watching some of the earlier videos I did this week on Tuesday, we broke out and really just deep dived and discussed where the federal deficit's currently at. According to the Canadian Taxpayer Federation and their debt truck, which travels the country reminding Canadians, how screwed we are when it comes to our federal debt, it actually appears that it's a lot closer to $1.2 trillion right now, according to the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, versus the $1 trillion that the federal government states. Again, sometimes it depends upon exactly what you're including, the timing of obligations and when you recognize those obligations. But just understand, for the first time in Canada's history, we are definitely above $1 trillion in debt and deficit, and that is not a good thing. Cabinet did not detail any plan to balance the budget. Parliament last balanced the budget in 2007, and this is the moment where I make the obligatory Justin Trudeau quote of budgets balance themselves, so why should we worry about that? Just because it's been since 2007, maybe we'll get around to it in 2027, and it'll only take us 2 decades to rebalance our budget. And there's obviously very serious consequences here. When we break it down on a per Canadian basis, again, based upon Tuesday's video, we're close to about $32,000 in debt for every single Canadian. And again, this is just federal obligations. There's also provincial, municipal, and, other aspects there that would actually cost the Canadian citizen even more if we were to try and completely settle all of our debt. Next, I just wanted to highlight, this is from the Government of Canada's website, so this is for the budget for 2022. A plan to grow our economy and make life more affordable. And one of the key things I just want to highlight here is what the government chose to highlight. So again, if we're trying to think of where is the government's priorities, I'd imagine they'd want to highlight it on this landing page. So when I look at this, I really see 4 primary pillars that the federal government seems to be focused on in this budget. Housing is one. Again, that was a very popular platform position for all the political parties in Canada, so no surprise there. Climate change, because, hey, you always need a crusade, and you always need a war that you can perpetually fight with no real obvious, destination or mission accomplished moment. Jobs and growth, and then affordability. And so, affordability is really, we're starting to talk about inflation and the average Canadian's ability just to, afford their day-to-day costs and needs. So I guess what I just wanted to highlight here is, again, understanding where the federal government's coming in regards of the budget, because, again, this is going to tell us where their emphasis is likely going to be with a lot of policies, not just this year, but likely in the coming years, particularly now that we've got the Liberal NDP coalition. So you would expect the Liberals to be pretty confident through 2025 that they'll be able to push a lot of their legislation and policy through because of the NDP backing. So jumping over to global news, just wanted to highlight here a couple points. Canada's Treasury depleted its budget, wins COVID spending, eyes uncertainty. So again, obviously unprecedented spending over the last 2 years because of the COVID pandemic. We actually spent the last 3 episodes breaking out for you guys exactly how much did that cost us. And understand that our total federal debt essentially almost has doubled over the last 2 years. And primarily the driver there was COVID and COVID-related spending. Now, again, how much of that spending was necessary, we'll leave that for a debate for another day. But if you watch the past 3 videos this week, I think we're probably going to be on the same page. So just want to highlight a couple points here. So she also stressed, this is Chrystia Freeland, that the government's longstanding fiscal anchor, a declining debt to GDP ratio, must continue to shrink. That ratio is projected to decrease from 46.5% of GDP last year to 41.5% of GDP by 2026-2027. And I guess I want to use this as a springboard here. What are your guys' thoughts? Do you believe that we'll actually see the ratio of GDP and debt improve over the coming years? I would like to say so. I really would, but it just feels like we're constantly staggering at this moment in time in history, at least here in the West, countries in the West, from one disaster to one emergency to the other. And whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether it's the war on climate change, whether it's the war on COVID, it just seems like there's always an excuse to spend more money and put ourselves in a more precarious position, financially speaking, as a nation. The extraordinary debts we incurred to keep Canadians safe and solvent must be paid down. This is our fiscal anchor, a line we shall not cross, and that will ensure that our finances remain sustainable so long as it remains unbreached. Now, again, with $1.2 trillion in debt, I'm not sure how sustainable anything is when it comes to Canada's financial picture, but certainly trying to improve it is a noble cause. But unless we're going to really be taking an axe to the budget, right, to various government departments, to various government programs, it's realistically unreasonable, in my opinion, to expect it. Now, there are a couple new tax initiatives, and we'll hit upon a couple later on in the show tonight. But primarily, there's still more boondoggles, more expansion of government programs, and more areas to throw money at. Next, from Canada News Media, Budget 2022, a checklist of promises that were in the Liberal NDP confidence deal. So essentially, if you just want to quickly have a synopsis here of, based upon what we knew the Liberal and NDPs agreed upon versus what's in the budget, this is a pretty good start. So dental care, the budget promises $5.3 billion over the next 5 years and $1.7 billion annually after that to help pay for dental care for Canadians with household incomes under $90,000. The program will start with kids under 12 this year, expand to teenagers and people with disabilities in 2023, and be fully implemented by 2025. Pharmacare. The budget promises to table and pass a pharmacare bill by the end of 2023 and ask the Canadian Drug Agency to develop a list of essential medicines and make bulk purchasing plan. This is almost word for word what was in the confidence and supply agreement. There is no funding for the effort in this budget. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland said that will come in future years. So again, no real surprise there. We knew that dental care was likely going to roll out in this fiscal year and that likely pharmacare would be down the road, but that they'll likely be trying to implement that before the next election in 2025. yeah, I think that's primarily what I wanted to hit there. The last one was taxing excess bank profits. So the budget introduces the temporary Canada Recovery Dividend, a one-time 15% tax for financial institutions on income above $1 billion for the 2021 tax year. That federal government also plans to perpetually increase the corporate income tax for banking and life insurance groups by 1.5 percentage points for taxable income above $100 million. Now, again, on the surface, maybe sometimes this stuff sounds good or sounds like a net benefit, or like, hey, at least we're taxing the ultra rich, right? We're taxing massive corporations, banks, life insurance companies, and things of that nature. And while I can understand that sentiment, understand this is the sort of like shell game that we have in our general economy at this point in time, that we have in the form of crony capitalism that is Western capitalism in 2022, where we give, unprecedented opportunities for debt and low cost capital to these banks and life insurance companies, and then we attack and demonize them and try and tax them at the same time. Like, it's literally like we're just shifting shit. Like, this isn't actually going to result in any dramatic improvement for the Canada's budget, and this isn't going to in any way create more affordability, help housing, or any of the other initiatives that the government actually laid out on their website. So I think, honestly, this is just something where they can point to and say they're taxing the rich, and they can get, a pat on the back from their NDP supporters. Next, from the Toronto Sun, Budget 2022, $452 billion plan focused on affordability, innovation as uncertainty looms. So again, this is just kind of the Toronto Sun's take on it. Just wanted to highlight what the total budget spend was going to be here. And again, there are some programs. I think there was like $13 or $15 billion that are earmarked for innovation. If I remember correctly, I think a decent chunk of that was related to green and tech innovation. But again, link to this story as well as all the stories we're covering tonight in the video description down below. Don't let this show be the end of your fact-finding journey, but really just the jumping off point. Now, again, from the Canada News Media, Budget 2022, $500 million in military aid to Ukraine projects projects economic upheaval from war. So previously, maybe 2 weeks ago now, I tried doing a deep dive and getting to the bottom of, how much is Canada really committed to Ukraine? And honestly, it's really difficult to figure this shit out. There's no obvious like one-stop source of information where you can understand all the different government plans, grants, pledges, and things of that nature. Again, oftentimes there's not like hard numbers necessarily associated with this. In this budget, there's a promise another $500 million in military aid and financial assistance. And again, that can take on different forms. Based upon my rough understanding, before this budget, we were around probably 1.2, maybe as high as $1.5 billion that we've committed to Ukraine. And again, some of that spending would be older than just this period of time. So if we're looking from like 2014 until now, I feel pretty safe saying that we probably have committed 1.2 to 1.5 billion. Now add on this extra 500 million, and we're getting a lot closer to $2 billion in total aid and financial assistance that's been given to Ukraine. And I guess the biggest question I have in these situations is really how much better are they for it, right? And I'll leave that for another day, but just want to highlight that because that's not a immaterial budget line item here. Now from MSN News, Canada offers more money to COVAX to aid in the delivery of vaccine donations. So Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada's donating another $220 million to the COVAX Global Vaccine Sharing Alliance. So just a quick summary here in case you guys forget what this program is. The funds will bring Canada's total monetary donation to COVAX to about $700 million for the purchase, delivery, and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines for lower income nations. Our collective aim must be to increase access to COVID-19 vaccines and other medical countermeasures so that every country has what it needs to protect its people from the virus, Trudeau said Friday during a virtual COVAX summit. This is just another government boondoggle. This is just a ton of spending and commitments that's really just going to make the pharmaceutical industry richer. But again, it does count as virtue signaling. So I'm sure lots of people will pat themselves on the back for this and other sorts of measures. I believe that, if I'm not mistaken, Canada's committed. Yeah. So the cash is intended to help Canada make good on its commitment to donate at least 200 million doses by the end of the year. Again, let that sink in, right? Like, we're a nation of 30 million people-ish, give or take. Maybe we're getting closer to 40 million these days. Let's call it 40 million. Essentially, this is 5 doses per Canadian that we're donating to the world. And then when you take into consideration that we've made commitments to purchase vaccines out through at least the next 3 to 4 years, we're spending a lot of money on vaccines, and it seems like half of which we may never even use or need for individual Canadian citizens. Interesting. It's interesting. Next from National Post, Liberals to go further targeting high-income earners with budget's new minimum income tax. The budget contains no details except to say that more is to come this fall, but tax experts say this is a very interesting move by the Liberals to address inequalities in the tax system. This is honestly one of my biggest complaints when we look at the tax system or the tax code in Canada, or really any country in general, is that we never actually shrink the tax code. It's always just adding another tax on, adding a surcharge, adding, a minimum tax. We're never just overhauling the complete system and trying to simplify the process. And what this does is it just creates more bureaucracy. It creates more government bloat, and it creates more opportunity for middlemen, in this case, like CPAs, tax professionals, and things of that nature. And hey, I'm a CPA as well, and I used to work for an accounting firm, so I'd like to think I know a little bit about that. But there's no reason why trying to file your personal income taxes should be this Byzantine, structure of having to spend years to understand the tax code. It should actually be a very simple process. But the problem is no one actually cares about fixing it, right? Everyone just cares about trying to make it seem like they care. And so it's all about the headlines. It's all about making sure you get press coverage rather than really just digging into the underlying systemic issues in our tax policies and tax code. This is just going to create more BS in the tax code. Again, we'll jump over in a second to a article from the Fraser Institute that kind of dives deeper into this and explains that any of these minimum tax efforts or things of that nature, again, will it increase revenue? Yeah, absolutely, potentially. But will it increase revenue enough to balance the budget, to make up for all the deficit spending we've been doing for years? No. The only way that's ever going to happen is if you start taxing the majority of Canadians. And one, not very palatable when inflation's skyrocketing, when the Canadian dollar is buying less and less. And two, it's hard to convince your base that you should be allowed to tax them more. But again, the parasite class, the politicians, they are actually pretty good at tricking us into believing we need them rather than it being the other way around. Next from the Globe and Mail, from tax breaks to homebuyer incentives, how the 2022 federal budget affects Canadians' wallets. This one takes a lot of analysis towards exactly how it's impacting housing. And honestly, we're going to see a lot of coverage over the coming days, weeks, and months about how this federal budget impacts housing prices and whether it's going to create more affordability for the average Canadian citizen, because that seems to be a real pain point for a lot of Canadians, and understandably so. Multi-generational home renovation tax credit. So this is a refundable tax credit for Canadians who are taking home building into their own hands. Families who are constructing a secondary suite for a senior or adult with a disability would be able to claim 15% up to $50,000 in eligible renovation and building costs, resulting in up to $7,500 worth of savings. Tax-free first home savings account. I honestly hate these things. I understand in theory why we had the RSP home buyers program, but again, we actually shouldn't. And this is just another complicated account, or essentially this is just another way for the banks to convince the average, young Canadian that they need to be saving their money in a bank account and use that in order to be able to someday hopefully climb the property ladder and be able to buy their first condo or their first house. Again, what we should do instead of adding on all these extra rules, regulations, tax savings accounts, and things of that nature, is let's actually just chop out a lot of the problems in our policies currently, rather than trying to add on more policies and hoping that oh, you know what, that drug just made him sick. Well, let's give him another drug on top of that drug and see if we can somehow counterbalance it. That's literally how our government approaches our tax code and everything related to home buying as well, which again, like I said, is a major pain point for Canadians and politicians. Doubling the first-time home buyer's tax credit again, and then first-time home buyer incentive extended until early 2025. Think about that right there. Just 3 policies. So the tax-free home savings account, the doubling the first-time home buyers tax credit, and first-time home buyer incentive extended until early 2025. Those are three now new complicated programs that are going to involve more bureaucracy. It's going to make it harder to file your taxes and understand how to do those things. And it's really not going to move the needle significantly for for the average Canadian, I guess I should say. Will it move the needle for edge case scenarios for people that like are on the cusp of buying right now? Yeah, there's a good chance that these will impact them and be a net benefit. But this isn't going to change in any way, shape, or form the systemic issues we've got in regards to real estate and affordability here. Again, that all stems from monetary policy, right? If you want to actually understand what's going on, you'd probably be a lot better served to spend this week instead of following and watching Canada's federal budget to following the Bitcoin 2022 conference in Miami that's going on. It's being completely live streamed on Bitcoin Magazine's YouTube channel. You know, until we fix our monetary policy, all this shit is just band-aids, and it's not even effective, right? Like, this is ineffective triage that the government's committing to trying to make housing appear more affordable. And, here's a nice little graph just to remind us of how wild the MLS home price index has been for year-over-year percentage change. Again, right now, we're approaching 29.17% year-over-year change in February 2022. But again, any of us that have been paying attention to Canadian real estate for the last couple of years, again, we knew that already. Post-millennial breaking, Trudeau Liberals commit to spending $56 billion more in 2022 budget. So again, this is just looking at how, despite the fact that they're trying to, be fiscally responsible to a certain extent, that we're actually still seeing more and more spending added on to the existing spending already. And again, True North had a similar focus on that $56 billion in new spending. Again, that's made up of different things like special initiatives, dental care, and things of that nature. Now, I want to highlight this from Michael Geist because I didn't see very many people covering this, and this actually is a bigger deal than a lot of people realize, in my opinion. And you know what? I'll save my rant for after I fill you guys in. Chrystia Freeland's Hidden Tax: How Canada Should Implement the Copyright Term Extension Buried in Budget 2022. Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland unveiled Budget 2022 yesterday. While much of the focus was on housing and the environment, buried in Annex 3 at page 274 was a promise to extend the term of copyright from the international standard of life of the author plus 50 years to life plus 70 years. The extension fulfills a commitment in the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement, with the specific implementation details presumably to come in several weeks in the Budget Implementation Act. This is both a terrible policy-making approach. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015 in part on a pledge not to use the budget to sneak through legislation this way. But again, every politician tries. And terrible policy that experts have termed a tax on consumers. Indeed, term extension was long opposed by successive Canadian governments, both Liberal and Conservative, for good reason. It creates significant costs with limited to no benefits. Yeah, this is really just extending the rentier class, right? My blue-blooded libertarian bent, my anarchist orientation makes me want to say that intellectual property just shouldn't exist in the first place, and we should actually tear down things like copyright and trademarks and things of that nature. And while it would create short-term chaos for our economy because it would take us a while to figure out how to navigate that new paradigm, at the same time right now, the idea that corporations, businesses, and people can own phrases, ideas, words, like genetic sequencing, seeds, right? Like, there is serious long-term consequences. And again, not a fan of this. And I really appreciate Michael for highlighting it because this isn't the way these sort of things should be passed anyways, right? Like, if we're going to implement this as a new rule or law here in Canada, let's have it go in front of Parliament and be individually debated rather than bundled into a giant budget, which the federal Liberals and NDP have already essentially committed to rubber stamping, which means that this becomes policy by default. iPolitics: Net Zero, more than $12 billion in budget to help Canada reach net zero. The budget puts more meat on the bones of promises already made in the emissions reductions plan. Again, I just personally think we won't find ourselves at zero emission despite how much money the government throws at it. And this is just going to create more opportunities for government grift and government contractor grift in particular. Next, from the Fraser Institute, no free lunch for the 99%, estimating revenue effects from taxes on top earners. So I'll leave you guys to really dive in and read this entire article, but just wanted to highlight one of the last paragraphs here. This evidence suggests that financing a major expansion of government over the long term will require tax increases that affect individuals and economic families across a wider range of the income and wealth spectrum. Specifically, we calculate that to offset a 20% increase in federal spending through a broader, across-the-board increase to personal income tax would require increasing each tax bracket by 5.5 percentage points. This would raise the bottom tax bracket from 10 to 15.5%. Alternatively, we show that offsetting a similar expansion in the size of the federal government, assuming no behavioral effects, by increasing the GST would require an 11 percentage point increase from its 5% level today to 16%. So again, understand, 5.5 percentage points when we're talking about the lowest tax bracket, maybe at first doesn't sound substantial, but then when we remind ourselves that, oh shit, it's only 10% right now, oh shit, that would be like a 55% increase in the federal taxes paid by the lowest population. Okay, yeah. You know what? While pretending like we can tax the rich and that somehow is magically going to balance the budget, when we actually dive into the numbers, it just doesn't seem to be the case. And again, there are unintended consequences often, right? If you literally put too much of the tax burden on a small group of the population, it de-incentivizes them to create value or earn money, right? And so you end up having one of two things. They either scale back their production and the value they create in the economy, or they leave the economy and they go find a better tax jurisdiction. Again, this is something I personally saw back in what would have been like 2014, 2015, and early 2016. With it was all the rave when I was working at a pharmaceutical company for pharmaceutical companies and a lot of other big corporations in the US and Canada to look at re-domiciling to more favorable tax jurisdictions. Like at that time, it was like Ireland, because I think they had like a 2% tax, or looking at re-domiciling in Bermuda, again, for similar purposes. Again, we in fact put together our own tax inversion scheme, and that's literally the name. It's all done in the light of day, but that was literally what we were trying to do, because the stakeholders in a company decide that, hey, the tax burden in these jurisdictions are too cumbersome, and so we're going to try and find a more competitive market. Next, from the counter signal, Trudeau snuck crypto crackdown and digital currency into budget. Again, we saw during the Freedom Trucker Convoy the demonization of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and everything oriented towards that. Essentially, anything that's not a CBDC, central bank digital currency. In Chapter 9.1, conveniently the last chapter of the budget, the Liberals outlined their plan to give the Finance Department $17.7 million to conduct a comprehensive review of Canada's financial sector, including how to crack down on cryptocurrency and potentially establishing a central bank digital currency in Canada. While the budget report doesn't mention the Freedom Convoy by name, it tacitly acknowledges it and cryptocurrency's role in financing the protest. Again, if the government really wanted to crack down on bad actors and their money, we would actually go after money laundering in real estate, right? We would actually be attacking Chinese money launderers that are laundering, it appears, like literally billion or billions of dollars per year through the Canadian economy, primarily in the larger metropolitan areas of Vancouver and Toronto, but to a lesser extent, other regions of BC and Ontario as well. And for all I know, it could be occurring in every province. But again, that is often viewed as xenophobic, as non-PC, as not fitting within the Liberal agenda. And so instead, we'd rather just demonize edge case scenarios rather than actually going after the bigger problems in our greater economy. Now from Spencer Fernando, here's what the budget gets right and what it gets wrong. I always enjoy his take and perspective on these things, so I'm going to encourage you guys, if you want to go and check out Spencer's perspective on all this, link in the video description down below. And then finally, just want to end off here with PwC. So they've got a brief summary here of a lot of the federal budget impact and their analysis on the impact of the proposals there in regards to, what the average Canadian's likely going to care about. So whether it's looking at that Canada Recovery Dividend, which we already covered, expanding eligibility for small business deduction, addressing tax planning that manipulates CCPCs, so Canadian-controlled private corporation status, in the context of investment income taxation, and reducing the foreign tax deductions that CCPCs may claim for foreign accrual property income, introducing a refundable tax credit for carbon capture. Again, not a fan of that stuff. Me personally, clarifies the government's position with respect to taxation of insurance contracts, curtails certain aggressive tax planning arrangements by financial institutions. Again, there's a lot more here. For those of you that are real estate investors, I'm not sure if it's actually highlighted here in this summary, but I shared it on my Instagram stories, where essentially just highlighting, I think it was like a Bloomberg article, but it doesn't matter. Essentially, the Canadian government will be going after, house flippers, anyone that holds a property for less than 12 months. That's likely going to be considered business income rather than giving you either the opportunity to have it be treated as a capital gain or even as a principal resident. So again, there will be, it appears, limited exemptions around that. But I encourage you guys, if you're a house flipper, if you're not already doing it as a full-scale business, but more of a hobbyist, you really do need to look into that legislation because it may impact you. Looking at making assignment contracts HST applicable. And again, none of these things are actually going to make housing more affordable, and it's not really going to reduce the demand for these services. All it's going to mean is these services become more expensive and more cumbersome for the end user. And so again, people aren't going to choose to just be virtuous and reduce their profit margins. They're literally just going to have to charge more in order to pass along that HST cost to the final consumer. That, at least that's my opinion of how this is going to play out. None of that's really going to have, it's not going to have long-term implications to the Canadian real estate market in general. But secondly, it's definitely not going to make things more affordable by any stretch of the imagination. So that's kind of our first hot take when it comes to Canada's federal budget for 2022. I'd love to hear, what are you paying attention to? What are you following? What do you care about? And is there anything that you think I overlooked or missed here? Because like I said, this is my first pass at it. I have not dived deep into it. I was actually really disappointed. One of my favorite commenters usually on Canada's federal budget is I can't think of his name right now, but a CPA here in Canada, and he runs a blog called The Blunt Bean Counter. And the first thing I did was I'm going to check out what the Blunt Bean Counter wants. But fortunately, he's been on hiatus from his blog the last couple of months, which means I actually need to do more heavy lifting to look into things rather than just being able to depend upon his analysis, which honestly, probably since 2015 or 2016, I've consistently turned to him as one of my first go-tos whenever a federal budget is released. So I'd also love to hear, where do you turn to when the federal budget's released? What resources, what pundits, what perspectives do you look at in order to really comprehend this? Because we're talking about a pretty large document that you're probably not going to read cover to cover in one sitting. But again, appreciate everyone that makes this a two-way conversation by jumping in the chat. So go and quickly check in there. We've got Abdul in the chat. We've got Al, Project LB52, Dan the NFT boy. I know I'm going to just have to write down how to enunciate your name, Palakik, because I know you spelled it out for me once, and I know it went in one ear and out the other, and I butcher it every time since. I do appreciate the fact that you're constantly in the comments. Al, climate change, aka the invisible enemy, it does work for a great scapegoat. No, I don't believe the debt to GDP ratio is going to improve. And further, I do not believe a single word that comes from Freeland's mouth. It's probably wise to live that way. When BTC as global currency can't come soon enough. I absolutely agree. It would be wonderful for it to be treated as a legal tender here in Canada. It would reduce a lot of our tax pain in the ass factors, that's for sure. Terry, I see no reason for people to have extreme wealth and ruin our planet to enhance their life experiences to the detriment of everyone on Earth. For example, $50 million trips to the International Space Station. Yeah, I can understand that perspective, Terry, but I think that when you take a step back and really look at the impacts of those things, at least based upon my basic understanding, when I look at Bjorn Lundberg's false alarm book, when I look at Alex Epstein. Sorry, I always get confused which it is. Epstein. When I look at his work and some of his analysis, one, I honestly do think that there's a climate alarmism where a lot of us just assume things are a lot worse than they are, right? One of the things when I was growing up that people constantly talked about was the hole in the ozone layer, about how, soon we were all going to be in a terrible position because of that. But last time I checked, it actually healed itself, right? I'm pretty sure we no longer have a hole in the ozone layer. And fact check me if I'm wrong on that in the comment section, guys, but I'm 99.9% sure that is true. So again, I think that while to deny the fact that that humans have an impact on the climate is truly silly, right? We also need to understand that all things have an impact on the climate, right? And while a lot of people will talk about the negative impacts of like global warming or climate change, is usually how it's framed today, understand that while we see, more deaths from extreme heat occurring, we actually it's a net benefit to society where we've got less deaths from extreme cold. And I might get my numbers wrong here, but I believe it's a factor of almost 100%, where literally the number of people that don't die because of extreme cold is double the amount of new people that die because of extreme heat. So again, there's some things that are maybe a little bit counterintuitive, or at least narratives and headlines that we never get exposed to. I think it's important for us to, make sure that we're focusing on facts rather than jumping to conclusions when it comes to subject matters like that. In regards to your other point about, extremely rich people ruining our planet to enhance their life experience, again, on the surface, I'm not going to find anything to argue about there. However, I guess if I was to try and look more for the nuance in that, that point, what I'd really probably dwell on is one, is that rich person that decides to do something that seems wasteful, is that still a net benefit overall, or are they still a net benefit overall? So again, while maybe we find it wasteful to spend $50,000 to go into space for a personal trip, at the same time, does that, support the space industry? Does it push innovation? Does that individual that can afford $50 million, are they still creating more value overall for society? I guess, well, there's honestly a lot of individuals that are like rentiers that essentially just are part of the parasite class, or they're essentially, crony capitalists that primarily depend upon like government contracts and insider trading and other sort of things that are kind of not in line with true capitalism, in my opinion. While there's a lot of people in that space, I think there are also true innovators that create massive amounts of value and generate massive amounts of wealth because of the value they create for society on a broad spectrum, right? And, we've talked about in the past, but a book that really changed my life was Atlas Shrugged, right? Ayn Rand's book. And when thinking about that, the idea of like a John Galt type character, right? The idea that, there could be individuals that are so driven that want to work so hard because whether they want to make the world better, they just want to amass massive amounts of capital and wealth, or whatever their underlying motivation may be. Those individuals, if you reduce the incentives available to them, right? If we reduce it to essentially like zero, like, hey, we're going to tax you 99%, usually they're going to find different ways to entertain themselves. And I don't think that society is necessarily better off for it. But obviously a complicated thing that I'm not going to be able to solve in a single comment response, but appreciate you jumping in the comments. We've got Al, IMFAO, the parasite class. Yes. I like this. Appreciate that, Daniel. Just to look like the government is doing something while they are not doing anything. That really is a big part of the government's job, is to pretend to look busy without really accomplishing much. Kevin O'Leary's keynote speech at the BTC conference was amazing. Only 10 minutes in length. Y'all should check it out. Appreciate it, Al. I saw him on, I think, maybe a commenters panel, but I didn't really dive into his actual speech. But there's a lot of content there I need to catch up on. Although Jack Maller's speech was fantastic, as always. Highly encourage you guys to go check it out if you haven't checked out his speech from 2021 or a speech from 2022. I've got big hopes for him and Strike. What else do we got in the chat here? Only 17.7 million to chase crypto. I'm not worried at all now. Yeah. The budget is useless, not going to help anyone. Yeah. And again, like, not that I think that one government or one policymaker is going to be able to pass a budget that would probably truly satisfy me. I think what I'd really be looking for is them looking to take these complex systems that we've created around taxation and policy and be trying to reduce them rather than just adding new layers of complexity onto it. Fifth, hey, what's up, Kevin? Appreciate you jumping in the chat here. We've got Tom, higher rates, higher taxes, not going to help people's pocketbooks. I agree with that. Hey, what's up, Stefan? Sending weapons to Ukraine will definitely help with low emissions. LOL. Yeah, Aries, that is a solid point there. And I appreciate everyone that's watching tonight, everyone that watched the special episodes earlier on in the week. If you like what I'm doing here with the Maple Pill, reminders to smash the like button, hit subscribe, and thank you to you guys, because I forgot to mention at the top of the show, but we hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. So now, regardless of when they delete my channel and throw me in the memory hole or make me a thought criminal, at least I can, I've got that little ego stroke of being able to check the box and say that my political views mattered enough that at least 1,000 people subscribe to it. So I really do appreciate you guys for subbing to the YouTube channel here. And if you guys want to follow along with me on Instagram, it's Matt McKeever Unfiltered, right there. And if you guys hate watching this on Big Tech, if you hate the fact that I'm on YouTube and Facebook, reminder, I do upload the replays to this on Rumble as well as BitChute. And I'm actually surprised. While I've got a lot more subscribers on Rumble, I actually get a lot more views on BitChute. So I'd be curious if you guys are watching this on Facebook or YouTube, but you found me through one of those two platforms, Rumble or BitChute, let me know which one, because it seems like a weird paradox in my opinion. And I can't tell whether if BitChute is actually just a bunch of like AI robots and things watching my shit, or whether there's real humans and they just don't care enough to hit the subscribe button. Don't know, but seems like the organic growth is definitely more on the BitChute side of the equation than Rumble, based upon my personal experience. But anyways, appreciate you guys hanging out with me on a Friday night. I know there's a lot of things competing for your time, attention, and energy. So the fact that you would spend it here listening to me talk about Canada's federal budget means a lot to me. I hope you guys get value from it. And we'll be back on Monday with another episode of the Maple Pill, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, same place. See you guys. Have a great weekend.
Asking blue pill, red pill, corporate press, I've had my fill. I'm just a simple chap, believing in my own will. Web fire, math, evil scheming, this is no drill. Haters masking boosted, but still with no chill. Need to come and